Have you ever noticed how certain people seem to provoke a disproportionate reaction in the groups around them, even when they only express simple truths or ask honest questions? There is something almost magnetic in this dynamic. A person presents a lucid observation about reality, speaks with authenticity about something everyone feels deep down but no one dares to mention, and suddenly the environment transforms. Expressions change, discomfort spreads like an invisible wave. Some avert their gaze, others try to change the subject or respond with surprising hostility. This pattern repeats itself in families, companies, religions, entire nations. And it may seem confusing at first glance, but there is a deep reason why conscious people bother the social structures around them so much. And this reason reveals something fundamental about our human nature and the fragility of the illusions that sustain our social world. During most of our evolutionary history, human survival depended on group cohesion. The isolated individual was extremely vulnerable on the African savanna, while the group offered protection, shared resources, accumulated knowledge. This dependence on the group shaped not only our social structures, but our own psychology. We developed an extraordinary capacity to absorb collective narratives, to synchronize our behaviors and beliefs with those around us, to feel and respond to the expectations of the group. This capacity was literally a matter of life or death for our ancestors. The individual who could not fit in, who questioned the tribe's beliefs too much, who noticed contradictions in sacred rituals, represented a threat to group cohesion and often paid a high price for their expanded consciousness. What we are seeing when we observe a group's defensive reaction against a conscious individual is a deeply encoded evolutionary response. It is not just superficial discomfort, but a self-preservation reaction of what we might call the collective ego. Just as the individual ego protects our self-image and rejects information that threatens our personal identity, the collective ego of a group protects the shared self-image and rejects any information or person that threatens the common narrative that keeps the group united. All human societies are grounded in shared fictions, in myths that give meaning and direction to our large-scale cooperation. These are not necessarily conscious lies, but social constructions that we treat as objective realities. The value of money, the authority of the state, the importance of academic titles, corporate hierarchies, national identities, religious dogmas, gender expectations, all these are examples of shared fictions that gained power because we collectively believe in them. And it is important to note that there is nothing inherently wrong with these fictions. They are evolutionary tools that allowed human cooperation on unprecedented scales in the animal kingdom. But the price of this adaptive success is that we rarely critically examine these narratives, rarely see how much of our social reality is constructed and sustained only by our collective agreement. The conscious person disrupts this dynamic. They see the seams of social reality. They notice that the king is naked. They recognize that many of our most sacred truths are conventions, not immutable facts of nature. And when that person expresses what they see, even gently, they threaten the stability of the psychic energy field that keeps the group together. For many in the group, this is a deeply disorienting and threatening experience. Imagine building your entire identity, your entire sense of purpose and security around certain unquestionable truths, only to have someone show that those truths are contingent social constructions, that they could be different, that perhaps they are outdated or serving hidden interests. This revelation threatens not only their beliefs, but their own identity and sense of reality. Throughout human history, we see how societies deal with these individuals who threaten the collective ego. Socrates was forced to drink hemlock for corrupting the youth of Athens with his persistent questions. Galileo was placed under house arrest for challenging the church's geocentric narrative. Countless dissidents, reformers, and visionaries have been silenced, exiled, or eliminated because their perceptions represented a threat to the dominant narrative. And this is not just a dynamic of large societies or institutions. The same reaction occurs in dysfunctional families, where the child who names the parent's alcoholism or patterns of abuse is labeled as problematic and rebellious. It happens in companies, where the employee who questions unethical practices is marginalized as not being a team player. It happens in intimate relationships, where the person seeking more authenticity and growth often meets resistance from the partner who prefers to maintain the comfortable status quo. What makes this dynamic particularly interesting in our current historical moment is that we are witnessing an unprecedented phenomenon, a simultaneous awakening of consciousness on a global scale. Through the internet, mass education, exposure to diverse cultures and ideas, millions of people are beginning to question narratives that were once accepted without reflection. They are seeing social, economic, and political structures not as natural and inevitable arrangements, but as human constructions that can be re-evaluated and reshaped. And this collective awakening is putting extraordinary pressure on the collective egos of our major institutions. Have you noticed how traditional institutions seem to be in an existential crisis in recent years? Organized religions, governments, corporations, educational systems, traditional family structures, all are facing unprecedented questioning about their legitimacy and relevance. It is no coincidence that we are also seeing increasingly extreme defensive reactions. The growth of authoritarian movements, the renewed religious fanaticism, extreme political polarization, the proliferation of conspiracy theories, the return to rigid tribal identities, all of these can be understood as defensive responses of collective egos under threat. When a collective ego is questioned, its first reaction is rarely self-reflection and adaptation. Instead, like the individual ego, it often responds with denial, projection, anger, and even deeper entrenchment in its existing beliefs. We see this in religious groups that, confronted with criticism or rational questioning, often become more dogmatic, not less. We see this in nations that, faced with challenges to their historical self-image, often resort to more fervent nationalism. We see this in families where, when one member begins to question dysfunctional dynamics, the family often unites against that person rather than examine its problematic patterns. The collective ego, like the individual, prefers coherence over truth. It prefers simple and comforting narratives that reaffirm its positive self-image, even if those narratives require significant distortion of reality. And it is precisely this dynamic that makes conscious people so deeply uncomfortable. They are involuntary mirrors that reflect the contradictions, the hypocrisies, the shadows that the collective ego works so hard to deny or hide. Modern technology has dramatically intensified this tension between individual consciousness and collective ego. On one hand, we have never had so much access to information, so many opportunities to question dominant narratives, so many platforms to express alternative perspectives. On the other hand, the same technology is being used to reinforce ideological bubbles, to manipulate emotions and beliefs on a massive scale, to increase surveillance and social control. We are in an evolutionary race between forces of awakening consciousness and forces of control and conformity, and the outcome remains uncertain. Artificial intelligence represents the next chapter in this story, with profound implications for the balance between individual consciousness and collective ego. These technologies have the potential to dramatically expand our consciousness, giving us access to information and perspectives that transcend our individual limitations. But they also have the potential to become the most sophisticated tools ever created for social manipulation and control. Imagine algorithms capable of predicting exactly what kind of content will reinforce your existing beliefs, that can personalize political propaganda with millimetric precision, that can identify and neutralize problematic individuals even before they have a significant impact on the group. We are already seeing outlines of this future: social credit systems in China, corporate employee surveillance, predictive analysis of social risks, recommendation algorithms that keep us in ideological echo chambers, all represent attempts to use technology to strengthen the collective ego and neutralize threats to its stability. And it is important to recognize that these are not necessarily malicious conspiracies by dark elites. They are expressions of a deeply human impulse for social cohesion, predictability, and control. They are technological manifestations of the same dynamic that led primitive tribes to punish deviance and reinforce conformity. I need to stop for a moment and ask you directly, which aspect of this technological future we are discussing awakens your fear or apprehension the most? Do you lie in bed at night thinking about this too? I know that we often keep these concerns to ourselves, perhaps for fear of appearing paranoid or technophobic in a world that celebrates every new innovation without question. But your concerns are valid and likely shared by more people than you imagine. Share in the comments. My biggest fear about our technological future is your voice can help create a space where we can honestly discuss these collective fears instead of suppressing them. And perhaps by naming these fears together, we can begin to imagine ways to face them. The fundamental challenge we face, both individually and collectively, is how to navigate this tension between consciousness and belonging. How can we cultivate greater lucidity, authenticity, and freedom without destroying the social structures that give meaning and stability to our lives? How can we question problematic and outdated narratives without creating a vacuum of meaning? How can we honor truth, even when it is uncomfortable, without losing compassion for those who are not yet ready to face it? There are no simple answers to these questions, but there are principles that can guide us. The first is to recognize that all human social structures are simultaneously real and constructed. Money, nations, corporations, religions have real and powerful effects on the world, even while being fundamentally consensual fictions. Recognizing their constructed nature does not mean denying their reality or importance, but gaining a more flexible and creative perspective on how we can reform them to better serve evolving human needs. The second principle is to cultivate what Buddhists call skillful compassion. People are not wrong for identifying with the collective ego of their group. This identification served vital evolutionary purposes and continues to satisfy deep human needs for belonging, meaning, and security. The resistance we encounter when we question collective narratives does not come from stupidity or evil, but from very real existential fear. When a person feels that their fundamental worldview is being threatened, they are in a way experiencing a small death. Recognizing this allows us to approach such situations not with superiority or impatience, but with genuine empathy. The third principle is understanding that expanded consciousness is not a final state to be reached, but a continuous process with no final destination. No matter how conscious we become, there will always be illusions we cannot see, narratives we accept without questioning, aspects of reality that remain beyond our understanding. This epistemic humility protects us from the trap of simply replacing one dogma with another, of trading old certainties for new ones, just as rigid. The fourth principle is recognizing that the awakening of consciousness occurs in a spiral, not in a straight line. There will be moments when we need to distance ourselves from social structures to gain critical perspective, and moments when we need to re-engage with those structures to effect meaningful change. There will be periods of radical deconstruction where we question fundamental assumptions, and periods of reconstruction where we create new narratives and structures that incorporate deeper truths. This is not a linear process, but a dynamic and continuous cycle. One of the most interesting aspects of human history is how ideas and individuals who were initially rejected as threats to the collective ego often end up being integrated and celebrated by the very structures that once resisted them. Galileo was condemned by the church, but his insights were eventually incorporated into Christian cosmology without destroying the faith. Martin Luther King Jr. was seen as a dangerous agitator by many white Americans, but is now celebrated as a national hero. Feminist ideas that were considered radical a century ago are now widely accepted as common sense. This gives us hope that the collective ego, despite its initial resistance to change, possesses a remarkable capacity for evolution and integration. Perhaps the greatest challenge of our era is how to facilitate this process of collective consciousness evolution in ways that minimize trauma and maximize genuine growth. How can we create safe spaces where individuals and groups can question their fundamental narratives without feeling that their identity is under existential attack? How can we present new perspectives in ways that invite curiosity instead of defensiveness? How can we honor the value of belonging and collective meaning while also honoring the pursuit of truth and authenticity? There are no definitive maps for this territory, but we are beginning to see promising experiments, communities of practice that combine meditation with social engagement, companies that are reimagining their structures to allow more authenticity and autonomy while maintaining shared purpose, religious movements that find ways to honor tradition while opening themselves to evolving consciousness, technological platforms designed to promote understanding between divergent perspectives rather than polarization. These are living laboratories for a new integration between individual consciousness and collective cohesion. A consistent pattern we see in these successful experiments is the shift from identity based on content to identity based on consciousness. When a group defines its identity primarily by the content of its beliefs, what we think, it will naturally feel threatened when those beliefs are questioned. But when a group defines its identity more by the process of its collective inquiry, how we think together, it can remain cohesive even as its understandings evolve. This is a subtle but profound shift in the foundation of the collective ego, making it far more adaptable and resilient in the face of new information and perspectives. Another promising pattern is the recognition of the importance of ritual and myth, even in communities dedicated to rationality and objective truth. Humans are not purely rational creatures, and even the most lucid objective analyses of reality do not fully meet our needs for meaning, beauty, and transcendent connection. Communities that can simultaneously honor our need for truth and our longing for meaning seem more capable of navigating the tension between individual consciousness and collective belonging. Perhaps the most hopeful aspect of our current situation is that for the first time in human history, we are developing a meta-systematic understanding of how belief systems and collective egos function. We are not only questioning specific beliefs within our systems, but understanding the nature and dynamics of the belief systems themselves. This higher order perspective gives us an unprecedented capacity to consciously evolve our social structures rather than simply being unconsciously shaped by them. When we look at the evolutionary journey of human consciousness, from hunter-gatherer tribes to interconnected global civilizations, we can see a consistent pattern of expanding circles of empathy and understanding, from primary identification with the immediate family, to the clan, to the tribe, to the nation, to humanity as a whole, and now potentially to all sentient beings. Each expansion of this circle faced fierce resistance from existing collective egos. Each step brought new capacities for cooperation and growth, but also new challenges and possibilities for abuse. And at every stage, individuals who saw beyond conventional identity boundaries were initially perceived as threats, only later to be recognized as pioneers of a more expanded consciousness. We are now on the threshold of a potentially unprecedented expansion of human consciousness. The combination of globalization, digital technology, ecological crisis, and spiritual development is creating conditions for a fundamental re-examination of who we are and how we relate to one another and to the planet we share. This is a moment of enormous potential and also enormous risk. The risk comes from the possibility that collective egos under threat respond with increasingly extreme measures to maintain control and coherence. We already see disturbing signs of this pattern in the rise of authoritarianism, the intensification of tribal conflicts, the proliferation of disinformation and manipulation on an industrial scale. When collective egos feel existentially threatened, they may resort to desperate measures, including violence, to preserve their integrity. The potential comes from the possibility of a wiser integration between individual consciousness and collective belonging. Imagine societies where personal authenticity is valued alongside the common good, where social structures are understood as provisional tools for human flourishing, not absolute truths to be defended at all costs, where respectful disagreement is seen as a path to deeper understanding, not a threat to be suppressed, where our capacity for shared narratives is consciously directed toward creating stories that encourage our wisdom and compassion, not our fears and prejudices. The deep irony of this situation is that the same human capacity that allows us to create and sustain shared social fictions is the capacity that now allows us to recognize their constructed nature, our extraordinary ability for symbolic creativity and cooperation based on shared stories is both the source of the collective ego and the resource that now allows us to transcend it. This is an expression of the fundamental paradox at the heart of the human condition. The same qualities that create our limitations are the ones that allow us to recognize and potentially move beyond them. For the individual who has already awakened to a more expanded consciousness, who already sees social structures as constructions rather than absolute realities, the path ahead is not easy. You will often be misunderstood. You will face resistance, sometimes fierce, from people and systems who feel their identity threatened by your clarity. You will be tempted to retreat into the comfort of conformity or to isolate yourself completely from the social structures that seem so rooted in illusion. Wisdom lies in finding a third path. Neither unconscious conformity nor total rejection, but conscious engagement with social structures as they exist while patiently working for their evolution. It is like the metaphor of the carpenter who gradually replaces the planks of a boat while remaining at sea. We cannot jump out of society to rebuild it from scratch, nor can we simply accept its current limitations. Instead, we work from within, replacing one element at a time, preserving what is valuable while transforming what no longer serves. For those still deeply identified with particular collective egos, whether religious, political, national, or cultural, the message is not that you must abruptly abandon these structures of meaning. These identifications serve important purposes and cannot simply be discarded without serious consequences. Instead, the invitation is toward a more conscious and flexible relationship with these collective identities, to recognize that they are tools for our human journey not final destinations or absolute truths. Perhaps the most useful metaphor for understanding this dynamic comes from child development. A young child initially does not distinguish between itself and its mother. Gradually, it develops a sense of separate self, but remains completely dependent on parental care. As it grows, it develops more autonomy, often testing limits and questioning parental authority. In adolescence, this tension between independence and belonging often reaches a critical point with open rebellion against family norms. But healthy development does not end in complete rejection of the family. Instead, it leads to a new integration where the now adult individual can maintain meaningful family connections while also maintaining autonomy and authenticity. Similarly, our relationship with collective egos can evolve from unconscious identification to rebellious rejection to eventual mature integration, an integration where we can participate in social systems, contribute to them, even enjoy the benefits they provide, without confusing them with absolute realities or allowing them to define the limits of our consciousness. And just as healthy child development requires caregivers who can tolerate and support the child's growing individualization without retaliation or abandonment, healthy social development requires institutions and communities that can tolerate and even encourage the questioning and evolution of their members without responding with rejection or punishment. The most resilient and vibrant social groups are not those that demand strict conformity, but those that can accommodate genuine diversity of perspectives while maintaining a sense of shared purpose and identity. If these reflections touched something you have been feeling, but perhaps have not found words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we meet here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us in this continuing journey. Subscribe so that we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with more wisdom and purpose in a world that often leaves us disoriented and divided. Observing the trajectory of consciousness evolution throughout human history, it is easy to fall into linear thinking and imagine that we are on a one-directional journey from the tribal to the global, from the mythical to the rational, from the collective to the individual. But reality is more complex and interesting. What we are seeing is not the complete abandonment of earlier modes of consciousness, but a more complex integration of them. We are not leaving behind the human need for belonging, shared rituals, stories that give meaning to our existence. We are potentially finding ways to satisfy these needs that are simultaneously more conscious and more inclusive. When we look at the wisdom traditions of cultures around the world, we often find a similar pattern. The deepest traditions do not completely reject the mythology, ritual, and shared identity that characterize conventional religion. Instead, they reinterpret these elements, finding more subtle and universal meanings within the particular forms of their traditions. Christian mystics, Islamic Sufis, Hindu Vedantists, and Buddhist Dzogchen practitioners often discover remarkably convergent insights, even while continuing to express themselves in the distinct languages and practices of their respective traditions. This suggests the possibility of a future where we do not completely abandon the collective egos that gave meaning and structure to our lives, but rather transform them to accommodate more expansive levels of consciousness, where our collective identifications are held more lightly as cultural expressions of more universal truths, where belonging to a group does not require denying our shared humanity or objective reality. This is the true evolutionary potential of our current moment. It is important to recognize that throughout all of human history, the relationship between individual consciousness and collective ego has never been simply antagonistic. It is a dialectical dance where each pole continuously transforms and is transformed by the other. Individuals with expanded consciousness often create new forms of community that incorporate their realizations. These communities then offer the context for more individuals to awaken, some of whom eventually transcend even the new paradigms, initiating the cycle again. Through this process, both individual consciousness and collective structures evolve together, each encouraging the other toward greater levels of complexity, inclusion, and wisdom. At the heart of this evolution lies a paradoxical truth. True autonomy is not found in rejecting all social influences, but in the ability to relate to them consciously. The most free person is not the one who has never been shaped by culture, tradition, or community, but the one who can recognize and integrate these influences without being unconsciously controlled by them. Likewise, the healthiest community is not the one that is never challenged or questioned by its members, but the one that can incorporate and grow through these challenges without losing its essential purpose or cohesion. Thus, when we speak about conscious people disturbing the collective ego, we are not describing a battle where one side must completely defeat the other. We are describing an evolutionary process where both can potentially transform into something more integrated and complete. The awakened individual does not need to destroy social structures to be free. He needs to relate to them with greater consciousness and intentionality. And social structures do not need to suppress individual consciousness to maintain cohesion. They can evolve to accommodate and even cultivate greater autonomy and authenticity. This process is neither easy nor guaranteed. There is ample historical evidence of collective egos fiercely resisting change, sometimes with tragic consequences. And there is also evidence of awakening consciousness leading to unproductive social disengagement or nihilism. There is no simple formula for navigating these complex waters, but there is a growing understanding that our survival and flourishing as a species may depend on our ability to find this dynamic balance between authentic personal identity and meaningful social connection. As each of us navigates our personal journey through these tensions, we can remember that expanded consciousness is not a personal achievement to separate us from others, but a deeper capacity for engagement with all of reality, including our social relationships. And that collective egos, however problematic some of their aspects may be, represent our deep human need for shared meaning and belonging. Honoring both these dimensions of our humanity is not weakness or compromise, but the true wisdom that our times demand. Perhaps the true test